Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ISFMP Policy Board. I'm Jim Gilmore. I'll be chairing the meeting today. Thank you for everybody for getting up early. And the coffee's flowing, so please help yourself. We have several items on the agenda today, so we'll just get right into it. First off, we have approval of the agenda. Are there any additions to the agenda? Dan McKiernan.
Yes, thank you, Jim. Under other business, I would like to discuss the possibility of the Policy Board tasking the Spiny Dogfish Board between the next two meetings to develop a draft addendum to facilitate transfers of quota that would be essentially underages mid-year to the southern states collectively, because at this point there isn't an opportunity, if there's an underage in the north, to get that fish into the hands of the states that still have fisheries.
Okay, Dan, I'll add that. Any other additions? Ray Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address state allocations under other business.
Okay, Ray, I'll add that to it. We also have two other items I got. We have to talk about a lobster letter and also a striped bass letter possibly, so I'm going to add those two. Any other additions to the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we will adopt the agenda. Next item is the approval of the proceedings from the February 2019 meeting. The information was in your briefing documents. Are there any changes to the proceedings from the last meeting? Okay, seeing none, we will adopt those by unanimous consent. Before every meeting, we have public comments on items not on the agenda. Is there any public comment today? Okay, seeing none, we will move right into an update from the Executive Committee, which is actually me. Executive Committee met yesterday morning at 7:30, so you guys slept in today. We essentially went through several items, and I'll do a brief summary on those. First off, the FY 2020 budget was discussed. Pat Keller, who's chairman of the Administrator Oversight Committee, led that discussion, but Laura Leach had given us kind of a brief overview of the detailed document. There was generally a modest increase from the previous year, so everything pretty much stayed the same. There was some discussion about it, but very minimal, whatever, and the Executive Committee approved the budget for 2020 by unanimous consent. We can go into detail if anybody has any questions on it, but and Tony's got more detail, but does anybody have any questions on the budget? Go ahead, Adam.
Do you have any update on plus-up funds and availability and what the Executive Committee would intend to do with them for this year?
We're getting to that, Adam. Couple of items down. Any other questions on the budget? Okay, so in any event, the budget has been adopted for 2020. The next item was an issue about some, particularly Pennsylvania. There's some dues issues that were discussed about. Pennsylvania has a rather unique situation, and our rep at the table has proudly paid his dues every year. However, the other two commissioners, they pay them independently, and they're a little bit in arrears right now to the tune of several years. So we are going to write a letter to the governor instructing them that the long-standing, since 1942, issue about paying dues to sit at the table needs to be addressed. So we'll be sending a letter off on that and hopefully correcting that. Next item was Bob did go over the APIS budget and a little bit more detail on that as to what was going on, and that was just sort of an update. So if anybody has any questions on that, we can get into it, but generally it was just an update on what we're doing for 2019 and 2020. Any questions on the APIS budget? Seeing none, now we got to the allocation of the Atlantic Coastal Plus Up funding. There's, as you realize, there was, and it's been discussed by Bob for the last few meetings, is that we have additional funds, and we had talked about some different options on how we were going to use that money. It was delayed because of the federal shutdown initially, and then we finally got numbers, and Laura and Derek from NOAA Fisheries went over them and agreed with the numbers. So there were some small projects that were approved, but it was decided that we were just going to add the additional funding and spread it among the states based upon the distribution that's under the commission charter. So that motion was put up and unanimously approved that any of the additional funding will be distributed to the states according to the distribution. Any questions on that? And Adam, does that answer your question, or do you have additional comments on that?
Yeah, so those small projects then, they're all funded, the rest of the money's going to the states, so that allocates what there was to allocate.
Adam, I believe there's roughly a little over $200,000 left from the plus-up money from this year, and the states have not determined what projects to use those for. I believe when they were talking that because there is some uncertainty in the 2020 budget due to that being a census year, that's money will sit on the table, and if there are projects that come up that folks think we should work on, then we can use those funds, but those funds can last for another 3 or 4 years? 3 years.
Any other questions on the plus-up funding? Okay, seeing none, we'll move along. The next item was there's at the February meeting, because of some of the work groups and some of the issues that had come out of some of the working groups we had tasked staff to come up with a standard operating set of procedures and policies for the management board working groups. Tony had taken that task on and worked and developed a draft that we discussed yesterday. There were some changes that were discussed during the executive committee that were incorporated into the document, and then at the end, the new standard operating procedures and policies was adopted by the EC by unanimous decision. We'll be distributing that, I guess, soon, and so essentially it's a good set of rules. It really does give some guidance as to some sideboards on how the work group should operate, and if there is some decisions that need to be made, it gives a bunch of authority to the board chairs to make decisions, but Tony can add anything.
And I'll, once the executive committee finalizes the document, I will review those policies and procedures with the policy board at the August board meeting.
Okay, any questions on that? Seeing none, we will move next to the future annual meetings. So for 2019, for all of you who have not been paying attention, the next meeting will be in New Hampshire, October 28th through the 31st. I don't know if Doug or Dennis want to say anything about that, but they're planning a wonderful, good time, better than New York, if you can believe that. And you guys have anything to add on that?
I'll just say it's going to be a beautiful time of year in the fall. There is fishing opportunities, but the Laurel Leach tournament will probably be indoors just in case. We're planning a lobster bake. The dress will be casual, not business casual, casual. So come prepared to have a delicious meal, and and please take advantage of our beautiful nearby town, city, Portsmouth. You'll really enjoy it.
I understand there was a move to have host commissioners' wives were not allowed to participate after my wife won the New York one, but I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway. Okay, and then Laura went into, so in 2020, it will be in New Jersey. So I don't think they've picked a venue yet, but we were talking about that at dinner last night, so we got a bunch of suggestions for you folks if you're running out of ideas. 2021 we'll be back to North Carolina, and then 2022 we'll be back at Maryland. So we will be planning those, and in 2021 I will be my full cycle. Will have done 15 annual meetings. So back to Annapolis to start, or hopefully in Annapolis to start over again. Yeah, Dennis.
Yeah, back to the New Hampshire meeting. If you Google Wentworth by the Sea, Newcastle, New Hampshire, that's where we'll be. It's a grand hotel from the old days, which has been refurbished by Marriott. It's right on the not call it Inner Harbor, back channel. Very nice location, very nice hotel, and I'm sure your spouses will sure enjoy being there, as they did 15 years ago.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, Ray.
Yeah, question on the New Hampshire contingency. You're going to make sure that the hotel keeps the heat on, because I can remember Dr. Duvall having to wear wool gloves at the round table at the Maine annual meeting.
It's not our problem that the folks from the southern states have such thin blood.
That was actually Maine, Ray. It's much warmer in New Hampshire than it is in Maine. Okay. Anyway, the next item, we actually got a discussion, which was an add-on on the annual report, and I forgot my prop, but Tina's done an outstanding job. That annual report is just gorgeous this year, and not because New York City's on the cover. It just is a beautiful report that was done. However, there was a discussion about it is pretty long, and there was a combination of the time to prepare it and how many pages it is, the length of it. Was it useful to the commissioners in terms of their business, and was there, would it be better to keep producing that report as it is? Would it be a paper copy and printing it? Would it be better to use just the electronic version? It is on the website, completely available on that. So we had quite a bit of discussion about this, and I don't think we got to any conclusion other than there was a bunch of folks that were, yes, they use that report, they bring it when they're meeting with legislators or different groups, fishing groups, whatever, that are interested in seeing the report. Others prefer the electronic version. So what we had concluded at the end of I think a healthy discussion that was pretty much split down the middle. Some folks really would like the report to stay as it is. Others would like an electronic version. And then Jay McNamee came up with the suggestion that maybe there was a hybrid version of this, is that maybe we could have a scaled down version of it, and so we would have a paper copy to bring, but maybe not as lengthy, and then also have an electronic version of that. So what staff is going to do is work up maybe a mock-up that we can look at and review for maybe the upcoming meeting, whatever, and see, and then we'll discuss it again and see where everybody wants to go on it. So keep your eyes out for that, and we'll see what everybody's opinion is. I've been going more electronic these days because my experience has been as I bring that, and a legislator will flip through it and throw it on a table and never look at it again. But evidently there are other states that have representatives that actually use that document quite extensively. So we'll have further discussion on that. But at this point, is there any questions or comments on that? Okay. Stay tuned on the annual report and what we do with that. Okay. The last official item we had on was the executive director's review. We sent Bob out of the room for 3 or 4 hours. It was a rather good discussion, and I'd be happy to note that it was completely unanimous and a lot of accolades about the job that Bob is doing. We all believe he's doing a terrific job, and we want to keep him on. There was absolutely a long list of accomplishments he's done for the last year, which is including, and the one I think we should highlight again, remember that some of the additional money Bob stuck to, did a lot of work on that and kept our 12% increase. So anyway, Bob has passed his performance evaluation with flying colors as voted by the executive committee, and keep up the good work, Bob. I think we're into, so that's the executive committee, and that's anything. Any other questions on the executive committee from yesterday? Okay. Next item on the agenda is from an update on the risk policy work group, and Jay McNamee is going to lead us on that. Jay?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be really brief. We just wanted to remind people that we were out there still. So last time we chatted, we had developed a couple of things to kind of support the risk and uncertainty policy. Sarah Murray and I have been continuing to develop that specifically with an eye towards developing guidance for the technical folks that will take a look at this. And so the current plan is to bring that now developed guidance to the striped bass technical committee. We'll introduce it to them on an upcoming call. They are going to be busy. We don't think this is going to take up a lot of their time, but it is really important that we get this in front of them so that they can review it, because this is exactly the type of process that it's meant for, and that's what we all agreed to as a board. And then the other group that we will be bringing this to is the CES committee, and we'll get on a call with them as well. So we've got a couple more groups we're going to get this in front of and work through, and then once we get that pilot run done, we will bring it back before this board. That's it.
Thanks, Jay. Any questions for Jay? John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jay, the technical committee report for the striped bass, I noticed they had in there, the 50% chance of reaching F in 1 year. Is this sort of what you're talking about doing?
Yeah, thanks, John. Exactly. This would better inform the process of arriving to that probability. As it happened, I thought the other day was a perfect example of why this is needed. I just kind of lobbed that out on the table just to give them some guidance, because they had none otherwise. And so this process is meant to get them through a series of questions that arrives at the appropriate probability based on all of the parameters in the decision process.
Go ahead, John.
Just follow up. I hope when we get this ready to take out to the public that it's explained very clearly what it actually means when you say 50% probability of getting F back down to the target.
Yeah, good point. I think it is a difficult concept. I brought that up at the meeting too. People often, it's a coin toss. That's not right. It drives me crazy. So hopefully this will help both explain that better and also let people know in a very clear way how we get to these decisions.
Other questions for Jay? Okay, seeing none, keep up the good work, Jay, and we'll look forward to your progress. Next we have is an update from the MRIP transition to new surveys, and Dave Van Voorhees was originally on the schedule, but Richard Cody's going to give the presentation for that, so Richard, come on up.
Yeah, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Richard Cody with the Marine Recreational Information Program, and I just wanted to give you some updates, short updates on some ongoing activities with MRIP, but also basically to ask for your help in that we're trying to better establish communications at all levels between states and MRIP and between all the stakeholders. So if you have any concerns, I'm planning to make myself available at the ASMFC meetings regularly. So if there are any concerns, I'll be here to help address those. I want to just, to make the point that, we welcome any kind of questioning or concerns that you may have and try to address them as best I can. The other item that I wanted to mention is related to that, and that we have been invited to participate in a South Atlantic Council workshop on looking at potential differences in the FES-based estimates relative to the older CHTS estimates. So the workshop is hopefully planned for sometime in August, and we'll keep you updated on the developments there. But we're seeing it as an opportunity for us to address some of the concerns that were out there that that we don't necessarily hear on a regular basis, and hopefully, by trying to establish this relationship here, we can, do a better job of addressing them more proactively. So that's basically what I wanted to mention, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Any questions for Richard? Tom Foti.
Richard, with the shutdown, there was a lot of problems because we rushed things through and it wasn't a lot of communication going on during the shutdown. I found it very upsetting to find out at the joint meeting what was going on, and all of a sudden this huge increase in the quota. It didn't give us time, and I think it was a missed opportunity how we could have figured out to do something on the quota. And I think I'm going to, later on in the meeting, ask for a working group. How do we, if it happens in Black Sea Bass, let's get out in front of it so we decide what we're going to do with that increase. But also, nobody looked at the impact. I mean, I got a strange call from a commercial fisherman that was former council member saying, Tom, will you take half our quota on the recreational side? And I said, you got to be kidding me. I says, we can't do it, but why? He says, because we're going to flood the markets. And basically, because you're giving that quota roll in the last half of the year. Now, it's a combination. I know it's not all yours, but it's a combination of things. So it needs better coordination. I'll leave it at there because they're worried that it will not only hurt this year, but hurt future years on that. So we need to know ahead of time, and we need to work on through that.
Tony's got a comment on that, Tom.
Hey, Tom, I actually don't think that is the quota differences is how the numbers went into the assessment. So we all knew that these assessments would be having higher numbers, and then the result of the assessment was that we had a much higher stock number, and then thus got higher quotas. And something that the council and the commission, Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Board will have to look at is, do the states want to look at the quotas, the allocations between the commercial and the recreational sector, and do we want to make any shifts to those numbers? But because that's how the commercial quota ended up getting a lot more fish, because we haven't looked at that allocation yet.
I think, Tony, you misunderstood what I said. I'm not saying that about the allocation or what I'm saying is between the commercial community, how do we deal with that huge increase at one shot, because it affects their markets. And that's what I'm saying, how do we do that? Plus, we could have done some of that, and what we're trying to smooth out states, do something like that. So that's what I'm saying, we need to get out in front of this in case it happens in one of the other species that would come out with a huge quota.
Yeah, Tom, I agree with you that probably the commercial sector should have been a little bit more engaged in the process all along. I mean, that said, though, I think that we have, we've made some steps towards improving that level of communication.
Lynn Fagguli.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. To that point, all I wanted to say was thank you for making yourself available. We do field some pretty tough questions, and some of them are good from our stakeholders. So I really appreciate your presence and willing to help us answer some questions. So thank you for that.
Other questions? Erica.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hi, Richard. Erica Burgess with Florida FWC. The state of Florida, as I know you're aware, is extremely disturbed by the results of the new FES survey estimates. Not the survey itself, but the estimates that are actually produced. So let me give you an example. FES generated an estimate of an average of 4,000 trips per day for each of Florida's 35 coastal counties, which is an average of 65 trips per day for each mile of tidal shoreline in Florida. And that's unrealistic. What is EMRP going to do to address and identify the biases in the FES estimates?
Well, to that effect, we are meeting with FWC this coming week, actually May 22nd. Beverly Sauls and Luis Barbieri are coming up to Silver Spring to plan a workshop to look at differences between the FES and the Gulf Reef Fish Survey and other Gulf surveys, and to evaluate those concerns that the state has said to us.
So to that point, the Gulf Reef Fish Survey estimates refer to offshore fishing effort for reef fish, and I specifically brought up the shoreline estimates that are statewide.
So the question is, where you had a question?
So what are the plans to address the shoreline estimates? Do you plan to move beyond the Gulf Reef Fish Survey estimates and address larger biases in?
The main concern with the FES right now is the difference, the discrepancy between the CHTS and the FES. And we all know the CHTS was wrong. It was biased, and it was biased low. I don't want to get into a back and forth here, but I think we will present information in the SSC workshop in August that will show that the FES is a better fit overall for estimating effort than the CHTS was. And I would caution against surveys or states that want to align their survey estimates with the previous estimates, because we know they were low. We know they were biased. They weren't representative of the general population. So we have specific information that we'll present in that workshop and also at the FWC workshop. The plan is to plan the workshop on May 22nd with Beverly and Luis, probably in the St. Pete FWRI lab, and and involved in the necessary folks. We're hoping that we can get some engagement from Division of Marine Fisheries Management as well as the FWRI crew, the research end of things.
Other questions? Justin? I have to say everybody's last name. They actually said, say your last name. I said, Davis, not myself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm wondering, would it be helpful ahead of this August workshop for states if they have certain estimates that have come out of the new MRIP model with the FES survey that seem, aberrant, that seem to not make sense? Would it be helpful to forward those to the program as examples to potentially look at when you're trying to reconcile perhaps differences between FES and CHTS? I'll echo some of the comments that were made from Florida, that we've seen some estimates from our shore modes that just seem astronomical and don't seem to make sense. Now, I understand the overarching that the survey FES may very well be a much better survey than CHTS, but that there may be certain instances for certain fisheries, and perhaps there's patterns across states that might emerge if states send in examples of certain fisheries that seem to be producing unusual estimates. So would that be helpful to send in that sort of thing ahead of August?
It probably would. There's a suite of species that the South Atlantic Council wants to look at in their workshop, and they've listed 3 or 4 that they would specifically like to look at. And they might be good examples for other states as well, because I think what you were referring to is the calibrations that are being used and how they may have impacted the previous trends. Resulting in spikes or troughs in the data. So those are the things that, I'd be happy to look at other species, but I think that for the workshop, we'd like to keep it to a limited few so we can get through them and give them a good, thorough, deep dive, so to speak.
Go ahead, Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify, I am talking about some estimates that have come out of recent years, the new years, not necessarily the back calibrations of the old surveys. But from what I'm hearing you say is that it might be helpful to forward that information. It might not get addressed in the August workshop, but that it might generally be helpful for the program to forward that.
It certainly would be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Richard? Seeing none, thanks, Richard, for being here and giving us an update. I think it's going to be a definite benefit having better communication on this. And just so you know, Richard actually has come to, recently did a meeting in New York at our council meeting, and it was great having him there because the fishermen were more angry at him than me. So I actually got to, anyway, thanks again. And he's got a very thick skin. He thought that was an easy meeting, so I thought that was good. So, thanks a lot. Okay, next we're going to get into committee reports. The first one up is the Law Enforcement Committee. Law Enforcement met this week for 2 days, and Mark Robson's going to give us an update on that. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As
As Jim indicated, we met Tuesday and Wednesday of this week and had a very productive meeting. And I would also like to thank the several members of the commission who attended the meeting and helped participate in some of the discussions. We provided some initial input. Mike Schmidtke from staff came in and briefed the Law Enforcement Committee on some of the preliminary options that are being considered for management of the cobia fishery in federal waters. And so we took a look at some of those. I don't want to go into great detail because some of that information will be presented to the South Atlantic Board today. But of course, as usual, the Law Enforcement Committee is certainly always striving for some level of consistency. So to the extent that that can happen between state and federal waters and between state boundaries adjacent to federal waters, that's going to be very important. But there were some concerns expressed about some of the options in terms of their complexity. We recognize there's a lot of moving parts to this in terms of either having coast-wide regulations in federal waters or not. But we'll allow that process to go forward, and these are just initial comments that we're going to be making on the cobia draft amendment. We also had some discussions again with some of the commissioners who came in and helped in that review of the ongoing efforts to work with the improving enforcement in the offshore American lobster fishery. And as you've probably heard, we have a group who's working on a way to purchase and operate a large offshore enforcement vessel, particularly for extending out beyond 12 miles in some of these deeper waters. And we also, related to that, had some review of the discussions going on with another work group to develop an offshore system, an offshore tracking system for these vessels that are operating far from shore, and also tracking systems that might be useful in determining when traps are actually being hauled, when hydraulic gear is actually being activated. And so that we reiterated the importance of having that kind of a tracking system available to better target the use of this eventual offshore vessel to make it more effectively operating and going where the fishermen are working and being able to maximize the efficiency of that equipment. There's a lot of details that will continue to be worked out. The state of Maine is taking kind of a lead role in looking at operating that vessel, but it would also be a shared platform, perhaps with other states. And of course, there were questions from the Law Enforcement Committee about funding and getting the money for the vessel, not only to purchase it, but also for its continued maintenance and operation. And so it's important to the Law Enforcement Committee members that that money doesn't somehow get taken away from existing Joint Enforcement Agreement funds or other funds that are needed to do the operations that they're doing now. We also had some pretty good discussions about some enforcement tools and technology. Pat Moran from Massachusetts, our committee member from Massachusetts, had their state has been working closely with an organization called PERI, which is the Police-Assisted, get this right, the Police-Assisted Addiction and Recovery Initiative. And this is an organization or an agency that is set up to assist law enforcement agencies around the country in dealing with response to opioid overdoses and problems that are encountered by officers in those situations. And just like everywhere else in our society, this is something that we think is obviously potentially a problem in the fishing industry in certain areas, just as it is in the community at large. And several of the states have indicated that in terms of enforcement, they are already carrying some of the antidote equipment or kits to deal with opioid or fentanyl and some of the other kinds of drugs overdoses when they're encountered, and this potentially is a life-saving action. But
In addition to that, Perry, this organization is focusing also on outreach and education and follow-up, sort of a community policing approach. And this is something that I think is very helpful for our natural resource officers to engage with the community at large and to work with them, not just to react to an overdose situation, but to actually help in dealing with this problem, which is a serious one, obviously, throughout the country. We also discussed a little bit about the development or continuing use of drones in enforcement work, and particularly in natural resources. And it's interesting, a number of the states now, we talked about this a little bit last year, and it sounded like there's 2 or 3 more states now that have acquired drones and have got officers trained up to be pilots of those drones. It's still at an early stage of technology use in law enforcement, where it's definitely being used as a tool in search and rescue, general surveillance, security, making sure that an area is secure if groundwork is being done. But most of the states are still not using it directly as an enforcement tool to make cases or to detect violations or to use that surveillance information in making a case. So it's working its way in that direction. There are obviously concerns and issues from a privacy standpoint and an admissibility of evidence issue, but it is something I think you're going to see more of our resource agencies using in the future for enforcement work. We also had a request through George LaPointe from the NOAA Southeastern Region Office down in St. Petersburg to get some input from the Law Enforcement Committee regarding the development of electronic reporting systems and implementation of those systems for the for-hire sector. These are things that are being implemented, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico and up the East Coast. And the NOAA Southeast region was very interested in getting some input from this Law Enforcement Committee, the Commission's Law Enforcement Committee. So we heard that report from George. It was a very good one. And we're going to continue to follow up with him and try to address some of the questions that he has for law enforcement as far as how such a system would work and whether there are any pitfalls or problems that we need to address from an enforcement perspective. And also, I think there was some comments made at a commission meeting regarding, are there ways that we can take a look at measuring the effectiveness of our enforcement activities? And this is a very good question. That's something that our Law Enforcement Committee generally wrestles with all the time, I think. And so we started an initial discussion at our meeting this week to think about ways that we can take a look at or measure or evaluate the effectiveness of our enforcement. And we'll be continuing to develop those kind of ideas. But it was interesting to me because in the discussions it came out that one of the key areas is in terms of how do we determine how effective we are being is we have issues with basic staffing and equipment levels. And so if there are some standards that could be applied that would indicate when you have, how much staffing you need, how much equipment you need to adequately address enforcement needs in our marine areas based on population size or coastal area or criteria like that, that these are standards that might be good to try to work up. So I think as a committee we're going to put our heads together and try to take a look at some of those evaluation techniques for how we determine how to best be effective as enforcement agencies. And then finally, at the last meeting in October, we received a presentation from the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council looking for some input from our committee on a for-hire enforcement workshop that was being planned for November. And we provided that input, and then we also followed up with some materials provided to Andy Loftus from the Mid-Atlantic Council and Doug Messick from our committee, Delaware representative from our committee, attended the workshop. And so we kind of did a circle back around on that to let the members of the LEC know how that workshop went. And we kind of reiterated some of the basic concerns
with the questions that were being asked about the responsibility for hire captains for any activities or violations that occur on their vessels. And of course, the law enforcement committee members did feel pretty strongly that the captains do need to be held accountable, that they are accountable for potential violations. And this particularly is important when you start thinking about commingling of catch, sharing of fish, and other issues where it may be difficult otherwise to find a violator on that vessel if you're making a dockside or a boarding check. But it becomes even more important to hold those captains accountable for the activities on their vessels. And I think we've had a request for more input on enforcement issues from the Mid-Atlantic Council, and we will pursue that and work through Tony and you as a policy board in developing any further recommendations on those issues. And Mr. Chairman, that's my report.
Thanks, Mark. Tony's got an addition to that. Tony?
And what Mark was alluding to at the end there was a specific request from the council regarding tilefish and making a recommendation to have consistent regulations between federal and state waters. And we're going to circle back with the council to get a better understanding of what they're actually looking for us to do, since the commission does not manage tilefish. We're just trying to have a better understanding of what they're looking for from us and the law enforcement committee.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, questions for Mark? John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the report, Mark. Hey, on the effectiveness of enforcement, I was just wondering if the topic of actual prosecution for violations came up. I know one of the frustrations that our officers have is that, you know, they'll write up a bunch of violations, and a lot of times the Attorney General's office will plea it down to practically nothing. I know it's also a frustration for the vast majority of our commercial fishermen that are playing by the rules that we have. You develop a small group of guys that feel it's more profitable to break the rules than to follow the rules, and just curious whether it's a problem in other states also.
Yes, that's a good question, and it did come up, and some of those are sort of the basic metrics that we initially were thinking about. In a year or two ago, this came up, and there was some concern or problems expressed that it was hard to get that information as to the actual disposition of cases, because in some cases they're handled through county courts, and so you have a lot of judicial jurisdictions that you have to work through to get that data. But apparently, more of that information is now readily available to the enforcement officers or the administrators, and it is something that I think we would look at to get a better handle on how well cases are working through the system and whether actual convictions and penalties are being applied adequately, because that certainly has a lot to do with their effectiveness.
Mel Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, Mark. I know you guys talked about cobia the first day, and I didn't get to hear that. But you know, as we move forward with Amendment 1, you know, there's some. Obviously, with cobia, there are going to be a lot of different boundaries and things where perhaps you have dissimilar regulations on either side of a boundary. But did y'all discuss or have a kind of a preference for what would work most effectively for enforcement in that situation? In other words, would it be preferred or better if in the waters in which you intercept the fishermen while they're fishing, if everything was consistent there, or if it's easier to deal with it from a standpoint of back in the waters in which they're landed or at the dock or that type of thing? Was there a preference, or did y'all discuss that some?
We did, Mel, and we went through, there were basically, Mike presented us with 3 different options that are being looked at and in the amendment. And frankly, the committee had some issues with pretty much all 3 of the options as being somewhat problematic to actually enforce out there on the water, or to have situations where, you know, you might have an area closure in federal waters on one side, but not on the other, depending on which state regulations are being applied. So I think in general, the option that, first of all, there was an option C, I believe, and Mike can get into this in more detail, that had it was going to provide for the regulations for the state to apply depending on where you're landing, but with the additional complication of special areas, special area regulations, and how those would fit in. And that seemed very complicated, and I don't think the LEC was too much in favor of that one. I think the issue of having the state regulations apply to where the fish are landed made the most sense as far as the available options. But the Law Enforcement Committee suggested that that be tied specifically to the state where they're permitted as well. So you nail it down a little bit better. And that furthermore, if it's somebody who has multiple permits from different jurisdictions, that the regulations would apply that are the strictest. And so that's kind of where they left that issue.
Other question? Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mark. At the Coastal Shark Board meeting the other day, the issue came up of potential circle hook compliance for fishing for mako sharks and or other regulated species of sharks. And it was noted that as the Commission wrestles with this particular concept, law enforcement personnel input would be highly valued and appreciated. So I'm just kind of giving you a heads up that that's on our radar, and probably between now and the annual meeting we'll be looking for law enforcement's input to help us wrestle with this concept of mandatory use of circle hooks for shark fishing. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mark? Okay, thanks, Mark. Great report. Next up, we have another committee report, artificial reefs, my favorite topic in New York these days. So Lisa Havel's going to give us an update from the committee. Lisa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As usual, I'll be very brief. I only have a couple slides. Atlantic Coastal Fish Habitat Partnership and Habitat Committee are meeting in 3 weeks, so I'll have an update at the summer meeting on those two committees. The Artificial Reef Committee met February 26th and 27th in Savannah with the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission Artificial Reef Committee. There were discussions on the Artificial Reef Materials Guidelines update, which should be coming out soon. The deadline to release, to submit all of the updates was April 1st, so hopefully that's getting released soon. We had a discussion on the impacts by Hurricane Michael to artificial reefs in the Gulf of Mexico off of Florida. We discussed monitoring protocols across the states and how to better integrate artificial reefs into the commission process, and I welcome any feedback from all of you on that. We had guest presentations from Jeff White on the APIS Artificial Reef Survey question, and a presentation on ocean brick system in the Red Sea. Everyone presented state updates, and then our next meeting will be held in 2020 by the Gulf states. We had a couple of committee changes. After the meeting, Jordan Byram was replaced Jason Peters as the North Carolina representative and the new chair. Paul Metters replaced January Murray as the Georgia representative. Patrick Barrett replaced Eric Schneider as the Rhode Island representative. Jeff Runchin replaced Christine Kittle as the Florida representative. David Molnar is representing Connecticut now on the committee, and Chris Laporta is the new vice chair, and he's from New York. As always, we welcome any suggestions for action items that you would like the committee to work on, and with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Lisa. Any questions? John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Lisa. I'm just curious about the materials update you were doing. Is this related to just overall the durability of some of the materials that have been used in the past, or is this more based on contaminant guidelines?
It covers all different reefing materials, so what's been done in the past, what we're no longer doing, anything from train cars to descriptions on tires to the different types of reef modules that we're putting out there, how to reef ships, all of that is going to be covered and updated.
Yeah, John, actually, that's a good question, because with the resurgence of the New York program, I've been getting some interesting requests on materials, anything from voting machines all the way up to entire buildings. So that was going to be very helpful as we move forward. Any other questions for Lisa? Okay, Lisa, thanks very much for that. Okay, we're up to item 8, which is a review of non-compliance findings, which we don't have any here, so we can jump right past that one. And we're into other business, so let's take these in order. We'll start with the issue on spiny dogfish. Dan, do you want to start that discussion?
Thank you, Jim. As you know, the spiny dogfish plan is a little complicated, a little unique in that the northern part of the range, the northern states have a quota that is shared, and they have a seasonal fishery which typically ends by Thanksgiving or around Christmas, and then all the states to the south, Mid-Atlantic and south, have state-by-state quotas. And with the reduction in the quota that's occurring next year, or this year and next year, much lower than what has been historically, it's been brought to our attention among some of the processors that they fear that if there's an underage in the first part of the year, that fish cannot be transferred as the second half of the year's fish can be. The southern states are allowed under the plan to move fish between them to cover overages and unexpected occurrences. So I'm suggesting that, and I'll say it right up front, I don't think this is a complicated proposal, and the Division of Marine Fisheries will pledge to carry a lot of the work burden on developing this document, because I know it's not in the ASMFC's work plan. But I propose that we develop an addendum to be reviewed at the next meeting, at the August meeting, to allow such transfers. And I have a motion, if staff could put it up.
Let's see if we got a second to that first, and we'll get some. All right, second by Justin Davis. Okay, so
a little bit more detail.
Okay, go ahead, Dan. Why don't you
so my vision here is that around Thanksgiving, is it 4 or 5 states? I can't recall what the northern group is. I think it's 4 states. Would get together and decide either to if not send all the fish, majority of the unused fish, maybe 75, 80, 90%, that they don't feel is going to be coming in the last 4 or 5 months of the year, to the overall quota of the South, and all those other states could get them in equal shares. Equal shares meaning consistent with the shares that they have now, proportional. And then the second part, you can see here after the word also, I'm suggesting that we adopt for spiny dogfish a very favored approach that we like in the black sea bass and scup plans, where if an individual state has a minor overage and the overall quota is not exceeded, then no harm, no foul, and that state doesn't have to pay back the overage. I think it works well. It's consistent with the overall conservation goals, and it minimizes the administrative burden of people having to move fish around.
Okay, Dan, thanks. I'm going to have a new rule: no peer-sized motions before 9 a.m. But anyway, Tony, you got some comments on it?
Yeah. I just want to give the board some information, and just as Dan said, spiny dogfish is a low priority in the action plan this year. As you recall, we worked on the action plan a little bit differently, and you all set high priority and low priority species. There is The only thing that's in the action plan would be to respond to changes in the data update for spiny dogfish for this year. But because it's only a data update, I do not anticipate the quotas changing much unless there's some dramatic change that we see in the data information. So there is no money in the budget for spiny dogfish this year. You will see here the southern states total catch this year was roughly 8.3 million pounds. And if Jess slides over, obviously they had a higher quota this year at 16 million pounds. Next year's quota, they'll be at 8.6 million pounds. If the southern states were to catch equal amount this year, next year, they'll still be under their quota. There would have to be a pledge for transferring of fish amongst those southern states, but they would be able to take care of it without that transfer from the northern states. And then next year after that, the quota does go up. In total, by 7 million pounds, the southern states will have roughly 3 million more pounds. So that quota would be increasing. So I'm not sure if this is a resolution to a short-term problem or if it does need to be a long-term fix or not. There are some other issues that we are trying to work through with the Mid-Atlantic Council and the New England Council in terms of the trip limit. This board, well, not this board, but the Spiny Dogfish Board has requested, as well as members of the Mid-Atlantic Council, to lift the federal trip limit to allow states and regions to set trip limits in order to utilize their full quota. And so if that ever does change, which we're hoping that we can move forward action on that as early as next year through the council process, then I don't know how that would impact these types of transfers, et cetera, or if there would need to be any additional changes to the commission's management plan, and which would require action at that time. And so just putting this out there, certainly if the board prioritizes to make changes, then we would need to adjust the budget accordingly to pay for public hearings, which I assume the states would want to have to do this change. And that would be up to this board.
Thanks, Tony. Dan?
I would counter that this is such a simple proposal that I don't expect a need for a roadshow and public hearings. The total addendum may be 2 pages in length, and so I would urge the commission or this board to approve this going forward.
Okay, Dan. Rob O'Reilly?
I support what Dan is indicating, and the concern, I think, is, and Tony will have the information, but I think it was the 2016-17 season, the landings were closer to 26 million. There is concern that with the just over 20 million pound quota that the market will stop early, and that type of approach doesn't bode well for the following season even. I know that the quotas were much higher. I think they're approaching 50 million pounds maybe 5 years ago. There is a data issue, definitely, and without going into a lot of that, I think that's still being worked on as far as strictly taking the average of 3 years of the spring trawl survey when there's imperfect coverage of the all the stations that need to be covered, and using that and making that decision. So that decision stands right now. I hope there's more work on that. One of the things that was talked about is situation of a mismatch between the survey and the abundance of spiny dogfish, so we can look forward to that too. But I think the main problem is you're allowed to carry over 5%, and that's not a whole lot. Virginia this year was fortunate to receive a transfer from North Carolina, but can't guarantee that those transfers that Tony's talking about among the southern states will be available this coming season, which started yesterday. So Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. Other discussion on the motion? I've got Jay McNamee. Actually, at least, Jess, can you put the motion back up? Thanks. Go ahead, Jay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we can, Rhode Island can support this as well. However, maybe I'll start here. I talked with Tony. One of the things that we're interested in is readdressing possession limits in Rhode Island. It's my understanding, based on my discussion with Tony, that that can happen external to an addendum, and so I just wanted to get it on the record that we're okay with this, but we have some other items that we'd like to discuss with regard to spiny dogfish, namely possession limits.
Okay, Jay, thanks. Eric?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly support anything that would max out the fishery. It's a relatively market-driven situation. Certainly addressing, Mr. McNamee's comments are correct. You need to be able to take advantage of economies of scale to keep the costs down in order to just make it work, period. But as far as this motion goes, it's also critical for the U.S. as a whole, the fishermen, the dealers, the processors, everybody, to maintain a constant supply of raw material into the market so we can maintain our market share on an international basis. And if this motion helps us do that, I think in the long run for the success of the fishery, I think that's a very good outcome. So thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Other discussion? Steve Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would support this motion. As Rob indicated, North Carolina was able to transfer a little quota. We don't anticipate necessarily being able to do that with the reduced overall quota. But this processing of these fish is fairly specialized, and as indicated, you kind of have to have supply in order for this to work. So we would support this.
Thanks, Steve. Other comments? I'll go to the audience in a second. So but I want anybody else at the table want to have a comment or a question? Well, I have one comment. And Dan, I understand that we can try to simplify this. It's the workload issue was probably from the chair seat is a concern for staff. And yeah, I think it can be maybe quick, but we know how these things go sometimes. And is there, and maybe it's a question for Tony, are there other alternatives for addressing this that doesn't get us into an addendum right away? And I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I mean, if it did come, we're going to do an addendum for essentially the 1 year, and then it's going to kind of get fixed again. And then is there maybe, if we are going to hit the problem this year, a fast track later in the year or something along those lines? But I'll turn it over to Tony and see if there's other options for this.
Could we ask the states, if this were to go forward, if they would want a public hearing so that Tony can be comfortable about workload? Because Massachusetts will not be requesting a public hearing. We'll take public comment.
All right, well, that's a good question. So, go ahead, Doug.
Well, I would request a public hearing for it, yes. I think, I'm certainly willing to move forward with this to consider this concept. And if Mass DMF is doing the lion's share of the administrative workload, I ask that we have some landings data in there showing it by month to see how late in the year spiny dogfish landings are occurring up in the north, because as I believe our landings have been going later and later in the year. I may be incorrect, and obviously I can check that myself, but I would ask that be in it. But I'm certainly willing to consider this, because I certainly believe in the ability, trying to be able to achieve optimal yield here.
Before I go to Rob, just a show of hands. So how many states think they would want a public hearing if we go with this addendum? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, go ahead.
So from time to time, ASMFC staff enlists the state representatives to conduct a public hearing. And I agree, if there's a public hearing, there's no reason why the state representatives can't hold those public hearings, and that may help out as well. You know, granted, usually when we do that, there's a ton of public hearings, but in this case, if there's just 4 public hearings, I don't see why the states couldn't conduct those public hearings with the materials provided by staff, which don't seem to be, you know, insurmountable. Thank you. And am I not in the mic again, Kirby?
Tony's got a question.
How about this? Let me know if you want a hearing with commission staff at the hearing.
Okay, let's have a show of hands. So who wants a hearing with commission staff? Okay, that works it better. Nobody. Okay. Let's see. I think I had a couple of hands up again. I missed Steve Murphy. Are you good, or you need another comment? Okay. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Okay, I do have a comment from the audience. If you want to come up to the mic and identify yourself, your name and affiliation.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Attorney John Whiteside, representing the Sustainable Fisheries Association, the dogfish processors, and my first comment would be a follow-up to Mr. Grout's question. There's no appreciable landings in the north after December 1st. Just a very minimal when you're considering the overall 8.5 million pounds that were landed in by my calculations, we're talking about roughly 3.5 million pounds that we were using this year's landings figures, that around December 1st we were looking at having just over 3.5 million pounds left in the north quota that could not be transferred to the south. And at that point it was just over 1 million in the south, and those, I mean, as of now there's just over 1 million in the south, and we're just under 3.5 in the north that can't be transferred down. So with this really dramatic, roughly 50% cut in the quota, it really would help with the just being able to sustain our market share throughout the world, and be able to alleviate any issues of transfers within the southern states, and by sending the rest of, you know, some appreciable amount of that quota down to the south where it's needed, so we can maximize landings for the year. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, back to the table. Are there any other comments, questions? Dan, are you going to run the hearing in my state? Yeah, I'm kidding. It's only kidding. Anything else? Okay. Seeing no additional comments, ready to call the question. Do we need any time to caucus? All right. I'm seeing everyone shaking their head no. Is there? Well, let me start with, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, we will adopt the motion by unanimous consent. Okay, Dan, thanks. Our next item is the lobster letter. Tony's going to talk to us about that. Tony?
My chairman has left the building for lobster, so on behalf of the lobster board, I will give you some background. The lobster board heard an update from the Atlantic large whale take reduction team. That meeting had happened a week ago. That team made a recommendation to NOAA Fisheries to collectively make a 60% reduction in risk to Atlantic large whales through reductions in vertical lines, as well as changes in rope, which would be 1,700-pound rope or a configuration of that. So the board made a motion to do a control rule for Area 1, which is the New England portion, Gulf of Maine portion of the lobster fishery. And in that, we are going to be asking NOAA Fisheries to implement that control rule as well for the federal waters portion of that fishery. And so the Lobster Board would be requesting that the policy board send a letter to NOAA Fisheries making that request for a control rule.
Thanks, Tony. So this is on behalf of the board, so we don't need a second.
And it's not to actually establish the control rule, but just it's just for the NOAA Fisheries portion of it. So it's not the control rule in state waters that this board is taking care of. It's just making the recommendation to NOAA Fisheries. So we'll need to clean this up a little bit. We don't actually need a motion if we can just have consensus. But I wanted to put the motion up there for reference for folks to see what the Lobster Board actually did.
Okay, Tony, thanks for the clarification. All right, any comments, questions? Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just wanted clarification at that meeting about what we're asking the feds to do, which is to set a control date for the offshore portion of Area 1 only, not for all federal waters. And that was clarified that was the intent, just so we're clear on that.
Thanks for that, Eric. Any other comments? So we don't need a vote on this, we just need a consensus. So is everybody, if there's anybody that has an issue with this? Okay, seeing none, I think we're good to go on it. Thanks. The next letter from the Striped Bass Board, we have to do some action on that. So Tony?
This one I do have a motion for, and I lost both of my chairs for the Striped Bass Board. So the Striped Bass Board took up the discussion of the Block Island Transit Zone, and the motion is on behalf of the Atlantic Striped Bass Board move to forward the Block Island Transit Zone letter to NOAA Fisheries. This letter is a comment to NOAA Fisheries to not open that transit zone.
Discussion on this motion? Okay, seeing none, is there objection to this motion? Oh, there's a, well, actually, I should have seen, does anybody need to caucus? No. Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, we will adopt that by unanimous consent. Thanks, Tony. Our last item that we had for additional business, Ray Kane wanted to talk about allocations. Ray?
Thank you, Mr. Gilmore. First and foremost, I want to congratulate the Commission. We just had a kumbaya moment with the dogfish motion. And now I'm going to regress to yesterday's conversation on summer flounder. Presently, one of the states that belongs to the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council is going through a judicial and a legislative process for fairness within the plan. Heard from another state about the socioeconomic impacts, and I'm speaking specifically to the state of Massachusetts. We have endured this failed plan for years. And for years, when I sat in a public audience, and this is my third year at the table, I have to respond to fishermen, recreational, commercial, fishermen, harvesters in the state of Massachusetts. Fortunately, being the governor's appointee, I can tell the fisherman, if he can't speak to me in a civil tone, that I'm not going to continue the conversation. Unfortunately, the employees on the DMF staff in Massachusetts, being how they're state employees, they have to deal with civil unrest on this entire management plan. We've been told for years, and this is the message I brought back to our fishermen in our state, that there is a process in place. We come through with management plans starting at the Mid-Atlantic Council, moving through the Commission. My charge now is that the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council has failed this Commission in moving forward on that summer scup and black sea bass plan. So I'm going to recommend to the Commission, and I've thought about this for years and I've heard it spoken about for years, that the Commission reach out to a third independent party, a well-respected party, and have them review the entire FMP plan coming out of the Mid-Atlantic, because I don't feel that the northern region is being treated fairly, and I've been telling constituents for years that we will get this changed. I heard yesterday one state sends vessels, they steam for 24 hours, fish for 12, and steam for another 24 hours to take out. In Massachusetts, the fishermen steam 10 minutes and they're catching black sea bass. So I saw what happened with summer flounder, and my fear is that the Mid-Atlantic Council is going to say, well, we pushed it through for summer flounder, let's use the same method to push black sea bass through. So I'm really looking to this commission, because I believe in this commission more so than the councils, that we bring in a third party, independent party, that's well respected to review the entire FMP. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. And well, let me just make some comments on that first, and I'll try to stay neutral. And it's a great idea. I think part of what we're seeing, and it's you know, I was sort of in a quandary myself, because I'm looking at two issues that happened yesterday. As commission chair, I really want to protect our process, but as a state commissioner, I want to make sure that we're moving forward. So it was a difficult time for me. And so you know, along those ideas, Bob and I and Mike Louisi and Chris Moore, Pat Kelleher, and Warren Elliott, I've had a couple of meetings now, and we're looking at the bigger picture of that. So along the same lines, but not only just for that species, but for the other ones, black sea bass, summer flounder. It came up from Delaware this week about maybe reallocating striped bass. So we need a different approach, and I think you're 100% right. One of the problems we have is our territories. We have to protect our state's interest, in addition to the conflict that we have to look at the best data, and right now we're running into brick walls over that. So we need to look at the approach, and maybe in our toolbox right now we don't have it, and maybe your suggestion is what we've already talked about. We need some independence of this, and maybe a process that we're going to agree to, so that when we get to the table, we you know, maybe neutralizes some of that. So I don't know what the solution is, but your suggestion of a third party, I mean, we even kidded around, is maybe we should have the Gulf states manage our fisheries and we'll do theirs. Because we all know the science, but when you have a dog in the fight, it gets to be more difficult to try and say, yeah, the science is saying this is different than it was a time ago, but I don't want to lose something for my state. So, so anyway, we're going to pursue that through the leadership, and try to come up with some better ideas, who the third party would be, or different ideas on the third party. But anyway, we're already going ahead with that, and I think we're going to have a lot of discussion on that. But so that's my opinion. I'll open it up to the table for discussion. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to check to see if you're talking about this for all species, not just for, because as Craig brought up the other day, striped bass, of course, is a special concern to us, and I'm sure every state has allocation issues that they'd like to see discussed. And are you talking like an arbitrator or a marriage counselor, or?
We don't know. First off, the answer to your question, yes, it's for all species, because again, it's a process issue, whatever, that we really need to look at. And again, we talked to NOAA Fisheries about this, and everybody seems to be coming to the same conclusion at that point. And what it is right now, I don't know. And working group sounds too light to me. This seems to have some, whatever we put together is going to have more clout to it than a typical working group. Robert Boyles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with the comments that have been made. It's regretful that we find ourselves in these tough spots. I would just challenge us and encourage us as we move forward with these difficult issues that. And to your point, Mr. Chairman, your struggle with being the chairman and also representing state interests. We all have people we answer to back home. I would just challenge us and encourage us that as we move forward, that we recognize our obligations to those folks back home, but also recognize our obligations to each other as a body, as a process. And we've all been banged on when we go back home, and you know, for instance, a number of times, you know, I've been yelled at for not fighting for South Carolina necessarily, and I recognize I'm guilty of that from time to time. But you know, the way I look at this is, I view my role here is to bring a South Carolina perspective to the problems and the challenges that we are facing. And perhaps not necessarily all the time fighting for South Carolina. So a little bit of a nuance, but would just encourage us as we move forward to encourage us and challenge us to keep that longer term and broader perspective in view. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Well said. Other comments from the board? Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could we expect some sort of feedback in August or a solution in August? No, not really.
Feedback, absolutely, and yes, we don't want to let this thing sit. We really need to start addressing this, and I think our meeting with the council, they agree 100%. We're probably late to the table at this, and we really need to start working on it. So yes, we will definitely have feedback at the August meeting. I seriously doubt we'll have a solution. Emerson Hasbro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with what Raymond was saying, and I certainly support going forward to explore an option here to help us make some strides in real effort toward allocation and reallocation. And I can certainly understand why commissioners from states that have a relatively high allocation of whatever species are going to be resistant to voting to reduce their state's allocation for the benefit of another state. But if we can develop a system whereby we don't put those commissioners really on the spot to vote to reduce their own state's allocation, maybe the process would work a little bit better. How we do that, I don't know, but that's something to explore going forward.
Thanks, Emerson. Other comments from the board? Tom Foti.
As I said when we were talking about this yesterday, we had a system in place. We had worked on a working group that actually came up with a solution many years ago. The problem was that we went from where we thought our quota was going to go up to about 32 million pounds, and we were going to do this over a certain point, that it went just the opposite direction. And as I never brought up the fact about looking at reallocation between commercial and recreational, because what are we fighting over? Scraps. It wouldn't make that much difference when you're looking at these low numbers. So as the numbers increase, and again, I think we missed an opportunity where we could have done something with this great increase, and that's why I say we should get out in front and see what happens in the future on those types of issues.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, I have a comment from the audience. Arnold Leo, you want to come up to the public mic?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Arnold Leo, representing the fishing industry of the town of East Hampton. And with mention of that idea of using an independent body, you know, to address some of our issues, I thought it worthwhile to bring up, because I was once involved in an arbitration procedure between a labor union and an employer. And there you have that situation where the union and the employer simply are never going to agree. And so wisely, somewhere along the line, they created the arbitration system, and it works. And I think it would be very wise now for the Commission to consider beginning to use that technique of arbitration with some of these issues, such as allocation, where we simply cannot expect, at least not readily, to come to any kind of sane compromise. So I just wanted to introduce that idea. Thanks.
Thanks, Arnold. Back to the table, Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I would have no problem with an independent body of some sort. I mean, yesterday I suggested we needed an unbiased something, but it would not surprise me if an independent body would come back to us and say, well, if you had a mathematical model that would help you in an unbiased way, which, in my opinion, we may have. It may need further work, but I think we have that tool in the toolbox, you know. But if it takes an independent body to tell us that's what it is going to take, I think that's a good step. So,
thanks, Eric. Dennis.
It's a very good idea to have a third party, but I think that we have to consider having the agreement of the commission to abide by the results of the arbitrator prior to even any decisions being made. I mean, if a third party comes back and says, this is the results and there's pluses and there's minuses, and we sit down at the table and it's time for a vote, we're back at ground zero, are we not? So I think that the commission really has to come to an agreement that we would abide by the results of whatever we decide to move forward with. Is that not true?
Excellent point, Dennis. That's exactly, you know, maybe you said it much better than I did, but yeah, we'd have to have a process we would agree to before we could go down a road of an arbitrator or whatever we're going to do, but it's a great point. I've got, oh, now everybody's lighting up. I got Bill. Go ahead, Bill.
It may be just stating the obvious, but just point out that setting up an arbitration process or a third-party review actually removes or disincentivizes the initiative to compromise at this level. So it's just something to keep in mind that going this route might actually reduce some of the compromise that takes place around this table.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, next I have Adam, and Dan's up. Let me go to Adam first.
I just wanted to offer that with our jointly managed species, we essentially have a third party that's been telling us what to do with things, that being the Mid-Atlantic SSC. And I think many of us would agree that that's given us a lot of angst over the years. So I would caution us all who say, we can't do this on our own, let's let somebody else take a crack at it, because I'm not sure that it gets us to a better place. It's a lot of work. The work that the board is going through on the black sea bass side, I give a lot of credit to Chairman Ballou for helping spearhead this effort, but there's been a lot of people who have gotten on board with it, including the service. It may not be moving as quickly as we'd like it to, but at least we're making progress, and I have every confidence that we can continue to make that progress on all of these issues if we just make that commitment to work on them and do the very best we can for everyone.
Thanks, Adam. And I would have absolutely no desire to abdicate our responsibility, maybe something of a hybrid, but again, don't know what it's going to look like, but that's a good point. Dan.
One thing I've noticed that we're facing is sort of the Magnuson conundrum, where we've got these dual objectives, or these competing or counteracting objectives. And so I noticed in the discussion yesterday, we talked about reallocating based on redistribution, but then there's this caveat that talks about preserving communities. And they're really counteracting. So I think at some point the Commission should not be giving that kind of a task to a third party. The Commission could give the first one or the second one, but you can't be everything to everyone. And if we're going to redistribute quota based on shifting stocks, that's going to be what it is. And or if we want to give this group or an arbitration group a mandate, preserve 25% of the change, or keep it for the community to do that. But everything's just too fluid with these counteracting objectives.
Thanks, Dan. Tom Foti.
I've been through arbitration, seen it work with unions, and there's always a bias when you get to the arbitrator. He has his own bias, or she has her own biases when they start arbitrating. We're a compact of 15 states. That's what we basically signed on. We passed the Atlantic Coast Conservation Act. We're supposed to work together to come up with solutions. I think the biggest problem here is we have to deal with the Council and the Magnuson-Stevens Act, because I think if we're just us sitting around the table, we can come up with a solution fast. We could have implemented this thing we did yesterday, we voted on the other day, which actually would have started solving some of the problems. So I don't think it's the compact that's failing us. I think it's the ability that we can work within ourselves to basically come up with solutions without going to the other people, the other parties involved. So, and I don't trust outside arbitrators. I really don't. I've learned over the period of time dealing with nobody's purely unbiased. They all bring in what they basically have gone through over the years, and where you're from. So
maybe we just need a special counsel doing an investigation. That works so well lately. So, John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know the idea went over like a lead balloon about auctions, but quota is money, and that's the reason this is such a contentious issue between states. Psychology shows that people feel the pain of loss much more than they savor the feeling of gain, and I can guarantee that states that lose quota in the process will be hearing about it, and the states that gain it, they'll be hearing, why is that all you got for us when you come back with an extra 1 or 2%? So I think, again, that it is an economic issue, and we should start looking at some sort of market-based solution to this.
Thanks, John. Robert Riley.
That was my sentiment as well, in that we often don't talk about the economic aspects, and we hear time and again how quickly market forces change. We heard a little bit about that with dogfish today, and yes, there can be more quota spread around, but what does it do to the economics? And so I think the social and economic part is something that, I know is difficult to really get information that's current, but, we talked about summer flounder yesterday in North Carolina and Virginia and New Jersey. They do try to at least increase their market share by virtue of when these commercial fisheries open and close. We have interjurisdictional fisheries, and yet we don't have interjurisdictional considerations of the market and how that all takes place. And I mean, this has been talked about for years at the ISFMP, and yet we're just talking about wanting differences, allocation to give differences the way they stand now. But it'd be really great if we had some economic profiles and even some social profiles. We heard a lot before about, with New York, some of the, infrastructure has been lost. I mean, I've heard that from Emerson a couple of times, and now we have to consider how we bring infrastructure back if there is reallocation. And I think along the coast that's the case. So, I don't know how we do that in particular. I know with Menhaden there was at least a social and economic profile of that fishery, and short of that, I can't really remember anything in depth from the ASFMP. When you talk about the federal side and doing an EIS, I mean, that's, or an EA, I mean, that's incumbent on those plans there, but I'm not even sure there that it translates into the decision making. So I agree wholeheartedly with John Clark that that's something that we really should consider. And when the day is done and reallocation happens, what have we done for the economics, for the market, and everything else? So thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Steve Mercy.
Yeah, I totally agree with the market analysis. Really, if you look at this, if you kind of did root cause analysis, it leads you to limited entry discussion to me. And so it's important to note that even though these are interstate fisheries, commercial fisheries, at least in North Carolina, and I would suspect in other states as well, are certainly coast-wide. North Carolina trawlers travel to Florida for shrimp and work up and down the coast, just as those trawlers travel up here. We fish for scallops off New England. All of those have been sort of integrated into business models, markets, and largely into coastal counties where that's all there is. You either commercial fish or you farm. If you're in the Wanchese or Dare or Hyde County areas, there's not a whole lot unless you're into tourism. So you know, it's important to keep that market that market in the equation, because that's really what's so important for the states with this allocation. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Lynn Fagley.
Yeah, thanks. I just jumping off of what Steve just said. I sat on a webinar with some social scientists who were starting to look at fleet dynamics and the socioeconomics of shifting stocks. And what they were seeing was, you know, the fleets will travel because that's all they can do is move where the stocks are going, but they would obviously prefer to fish close. But the problem is that they can't, because there's nothing to fish on close, because they don't have the allocation or the quota or the species. And so what that kind of leads to is that this is the sort of thing that can't be considered in a species-specific vacuum. So it really almost becomes a multi-species problem where as the stocks are shifting, and if we're trying to keep fleets close to home, what's gonna fill the void as allocation shifts.
Thanks, Lynn. Okay, I think we've had a good discussion on this. Again, this is the beginning of this right now, and obviously we're going to be discussing it quite a bit. So I thank Ray for raising it. It's a great point, and obviously we got just about every state weighed in on this, so it's something we are going to have to address. And again, Bob and I will work with the council, and we'll come back and hopefully start getting something on paper that maybe gets us in the right direction. So any other, Tom Foti? Okay, any other business to come before the board? Go ahead, Tom.
As we saw with striped bass, and as we're seeing with summer flounder and black sea bass and red snapper, we have a big problem with catch and release. When the numbers in the recreational sector start basically rising above what we're taking home with killing by catch and release, it starts being an extreme problem, especially when it starts affecting the stocks. Years ago, the ASFMP formed a committee. I sat as chair of that, was to look at, actually a working group, to look at circle hooks and what circle hooks we should be doing if we're going to do law enforcement. And since I was on the board of ASA at the time, I asked them if they get the hook manufacturers. Well, after 2 years trying to deal with Mustad, Gamakatsu, Eagle Claw, trying to find out what they thought was a circle hook, there was 14 different hooks they said were circle hooks. So, it winds up being a problem, but we need to move that direction. And we need to look, and I'd be willing to basically talk to ASA again, try to get the hook manufacturers to do that. The other thing I looked at years ago on summer flounder, we shouldn't be selling rigs in the tackle stores that have 1-0 and 2-0 hooks for summer flounder. It's a gut hooking experience when I see them up there. And I've asked, and again, we looked at a phase-in period that we would get off those hooks, because we know they should be at least 5, 6, or 7-0 hooks. So I think we really should start looking at that. And of course, I sit on government affairs at ASA, so I hear all the red snapper stories going on and on forever between the Gulf and the West Coast. So I think we need to do that. We need to start looking at how we do that. I'd volunteer to be on any of those working groups you want, and if you want me to reach out to ASA about the hook thing, I could put a little group together to sit and look at. But we're not discussing how the hooks, because we go to law enforcement, tell them we want circle hooks, then they're going to ask us, well, what is a circle hook and what are they, can it be offset, can it not be offset, and all those questions. So I'm just trying to get the ball rolling on this. I know it's late, and so and I got to catch a flight, but anyway, I'm just bringing that to your attention, and I'm willing to work on it.
Okay, Tom, thanks, and I'll follow up with you on that after, you know. Marty?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just hopefully a simple inquiry into the status of the funding for the cooperative winter striped bass tagging efforts, if we know any. I know we had that bridge for this past year, and that data set's now past 30 years, and just curious where we are with that, if we know. Thanks.
Marty, I'm going to have to email the board out that information. I don't think we've really brought up questions about next year's tagging study yet, and we'll have to do that and go there.
You win the award, Tony. You stumped. Marty, you stumped Tony. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick follow-up to Tom Voddie's comments. I think as a commission we would be wise to be thinking in the future about ways to reduce hook and release mortality. It isn't just circle hooks. There are other methods in the toolbox for reducing hook and release mortality. Maryland made some strides with that with their striped bass proposal in the Bay, and there may be other possibilities that would help us down that road. Thank you.
Agreed, Roy. Good point. Okay, anything else to bring up before the policy board? Seeing none, a motion to adjourn by Doug Grout and seconded by everyone. Thanks, everyone. And